Okay, guys, this is Chapter 19, World War I, where we talk about World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars, but really started a war. So what we have here is the precursor to war, Woodrow Wilson's diplomacy. He wanted to embark in new ideas in the area of international affair, ideas that sheer honesty and unselfishness should prevail over nationalistic, self-seeking and American foreign policy. That may be something that you're hearing today in politics, kind of like if we're nice, everybody will like us. We'll see what happens with this policy. Wilson opposed imperialism and believed that democracy was essential to a nation's stability and prosperity. The Mexican Revolution of 1884 to 1911. Porfirio Diaz ruled Mexico. In 1911, a revolution erupted, forcing Diaz to flee the country. Once Diaz fled the country, Francisco Madero replaced Diaz, but was soon killed, presumably by Victoriano Huerta's orders. Wilson sends troops to Mexico. You know, it's very close, and you can see the area down there below us, and so everybody gets a little nervous when things get a little irrational in Mexico, so that's why he did it. After an incident of April 1914, President Wilson sent Marines to seize the Mexican port of Veracruz. Upon their arrival, many anti-American riots broke out in Mexico. Wilson's Mexican policy damaged U.S. foreign relations. The British ridiculed the president's attempt to shoot the Mexicans into self-government. This will establish future ramifications of the Zimmerman Note, which we'll see in Section 2. The outbreak of World War I, the alliance system. In order for countries to protect themselves from other enemy countries, many countries would form alliances with other countries. Now think of this. This is like finding friends on the playground to protect you. Two examples of alliances are the Triple Alliance and the Franco-Russian Alliance. And then the naval race. Early in the conflict, Great Britain had remained neutral. However, when Germany challenged them for naval supremacy, the tensions between the two countries greatly increased. They pushed Britain to become allies with Russia and France, and created the Triple Entente: Russia, France, and Britain. Now, here's something that helps to spill over. I want you guys to look at all of these pictures because I've really provided you with quite a few. And you can definitely see all of the alliances in that map of 1914. So you see who's stacking up against whose side, who's neutral, neutral meaning I don't want to get involved. So basically it's the green against the peach, and the yellowish gold color are the we don't want to get involved people. You can see Sarajevo, where this incident I'm about to talk about takes place with the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and you can see all the players in this particular area. The Balkan crisis. In the late 1800s, there was a strong sense of nationalism through Europe. Nationalism is a sense of my superiority based upon what nation I am from. Not just superiority, but alliance to other people that look, talk, and act like me and have the same heritage. An area that was hit hard by this was the Balkans. The Balkans were usually controlled by the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When the idea of nationalism spread, many of the countries that made up the Balkans pushed for independence. And now a continent goes to war. In late June of 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that is the actual picture of him shaking hands there in the before picture, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by Serbian nationalists named Gavrilo Princip. This action led to several countries declaring war on one another. This was the start of World War I on the European continent. So you can see all those people there. You can see a reenactment of the killing. And I'll have you read that in one of your questions. It says, interesting historical note. I am only in line for the throne because of a scandalous love affair between my cousin and a much younger heiress. He, Prince Rudolph, killed his lover Mary and then committed suicide, leaving my father in line to the throne. To think the world changed because of one man and the woman he loved, I suppose. And look all of that up on Google, in fact, and see all of the players in that game. It was pretty interesting. So, nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and alliances. These are basic words that you will need to understand in order to understand World War II. I've explained nationalism to you already. Imperialism is competition among European countries to establish colonies. For example, South America and Africa get raw materials from those areas and send them back to the mother country, which could be England or France or typically European countries. But as you know, Guam and the Philippines, Puerto Rico, those places were controlled by the United States. Militarism is the concept of an arms race where we start to stack up our military against one another. If you have 10 armies, I'm going to have 20. If you have 30,000 guns, I'm going to have 40,000 guns. And alliances. This is the playground mentality that I told you about, where we are going to try and get as many people on our side as possible. So you can see that there as well. And the different alliances that took place at the time. Now, please concentrate on these leaders here and what they look like and who they are. You can see Great Britain's leader, you can see Germany's leader, Russia's leader, and France's leader. You already saw the leader, Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Right now we're going to look at Germany's plan that fails. Originally, Germany planned on attacking France quickly and knocking them out of the war. Once France had been taken out of the picture, the Germans believed that they could focus on Russia. See, Germany's in the middle, and you can't fight people on either side of you. Try to picture that. There's always somebody at your back attacking. So that's the Eastern and the Western front. So France is on the Western front, and they're going to try to knock them out. Germany's plan had one major problem. In order to attack France, they would have to march through Belgium. Britain had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality. Once the German troops crossed Belgium's border, Britain declared war on Germany. Oh no, that's one more enemy that now Germany has to deal with. Now, American neutrality means that Woodrow Wilson was trying to stay out. Although he declared neutrality, Woodrow Wilson, our president, and hoped to keep the United States out of World War I, many American citizens took sides. Okay, you gotta love it when the phone rings. The cause for this war was due to the high immigration, or the cause for this alliance system, or people taking sides, was because of the immigration level. You know, most of these people in the United States had just left these countries, so they still felt a very strong tie towards those areas. Pro-British sentiment during World War I, prior to the involvement in the United States, many of Woodrow Wilson's cabinet members were pro-British. Many saw this as an opportunity to support Britain and to keep international balance of power. During this time, many rich Americans were actually going over to Great Britain and marrying people with titles. So, for example, when we get into some of the British aristocracy, they were actually children of Americans. And so the ties between the two become pretty tight. Business link, like many Americans' feelings, many businesses also tended to want to see an Allied victory. The East Coast had strong British ties, and many American makes began to invest heavily in Allied victory. However, in the Midwest, where pro-German feelings were the strongest, it lent $27 million to Germany, if you can imagine that. Well, here's something that kind of turned the tide. Well, exactly two things, because we're looking at two things there. The sinking of the Lusitania, which you guys will watch a video on, and then the Zimmerman note. So first we have the British blockade. Shortly after the start of the war, the British deployed their navy to blockade Germany so they could not get supplies. The British planted mines in the North Sea and forced neutral ships into the port for inspections to confirm they were not trying to supply Germany. In order to combat that, the German created U-boats, underwater boats, also called submarines, to get around the blockade. Lusitania. After sinking a number of merchant ships that the Germans claimed were disguised warships, the Germans sunk the Lusitania. Now, there were warnings about this. They knew it was going to happen, but they did follow through with their word. The Lusitania was a British passenger liner. The sinking of the Lusitania killed nearly 1,200 passengers, including 128 Americans. The United States declares war. Looks like I used my picture to cover up some information. After the Lusitania had been sunk, America was close to joining the war. The Zimmerman telegram on the right down below served as the straw that broke the camel's back. Arthur Zimmerman was the German ambassador to Mexico. Zimmerman proposed that Mexico join Germany if war were to break out between Germany and the United States. The telegram explained that Mexico would regain its lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona after the war. Germany then destroyed 6 U.S. ships with U-boats, not thinking that the U.S. could assemble a military and transport it to Europe quick enough to prevent the Allies' collapse. On April 2nd, 1917, the U.S. declares war on Germany. On April 6, 1917, Wilson signed the resolution that America goes to war. And sorry you guys can't see. Okay, so we are on section 2 now, selective service. Once the war started, many American citizens volunteered to join the cause of war. However, a lot of people thought more soldiers were needed. This led to every man between 21 and 30 having to sign up for the draft. In total, about 2.8 million Americans were drafted. African Americans in the war. During World War I, 400,000 African Americans were drafted, and 42,000 saw action in Europe. In their time serving, many faced forms of prejudice and discrimination. Although they faced many challenges, many of the battles fought by their infantries were bitter. Many Africans drew praise from the United States as well as Allied commanders. And women in the military? World War I served as the first war women actually served in armed forces. However, women did not serve in combat positions. Many women served as nurses and clerical workers. By the end of the war, thousands of women served in the Army and Navy, and thousands of those women served overseas. If you've been paying attention to all of our discussions over time, you had to have noticed that during times of war, women and African Americans seem to get better lives because they are given more opportunities. War industries. The War Industries Board, known as the WIB, the War Industry Board's job was to coordinate the production of war materials. In 1918, the WIB gained more power and was controlled by Bernard Barch. Food and fuel. Herbert Hoover, yes, of famed Hoover Dam, was in charge of the Food Administration. His call was for saving more food. If you look down at the bottom right picture, that is a propaganda poster telling you to do so. Hoover did not want to rationalize the food, but encouraged Americans not to waste the food. He also encouraged Americans to serve just the right portion. The Fuel Administration was run by Harry Garfield. Garfield created daylight savings time and shortened the work weeks for factories that did not produce war material. And paying for the war? Well, one way is by war bonds. And war bonds or Liberty bonds were investments that Americans made to pay towards the government, and then they would be, or victory bonds, they would be cashed out later. By the end of World War I, the U.S. was spending about $44 million a day. That became a total expenditure of about $32 billion. In order to fund the war after raising taxes on corporate profits, the government borrowed more than $20 billion from the American people by selling Liberty or victory bonds. By purchasing bonds, Americans were loaning the government money. The government paid the loans back with interest in a specific number of years. For example, if something said, buy Liberty bonds and defeat the Huns are the Germans, and buying the Liberty bonds are a way of supporting the government. Now, looking at this, the mobilization of the workforce, we're looking at women, the great migration of African Americans and Mexicans, and how they head north based upon the jobs that were being offered. And if you look at that picture below of the map, you can see the different areas where these people ended up. Women's support industry during the war, many men were out serving the country. Women were expected to pick up the slack. Many women took factory jobs and manufacturing jobs. Women also took jobs in shipping and railroad industries as well. Once the war ended, women were replaced by men in their original positions. This changed the way women were viewed in American society. With the Great Migration, large numbers of white workers were being drafted and sent to war as soldiers. This opened the doors for African Americans to fill jobs in the U.S. This led to between 300,000 and 500,000 African Americans who left the South to settle in northern cities. Mexican Americans head north. Similar to the movement of the African American workers, Mexican workers took advantage of the U.S. being at war. Several Mexicans moved to Texas, Arizona, California, and New Mexico to work for farmers. Others moved to the Midwest and northern cities to work as well. From 1917 to 1920, over 100,000 Mexicans migrated to the United States. ensuring public support. So now we are on section 3. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We're still in section 2. In order to make the war more appealing to the public eye, the Committee on Public Information, which was led by George Creel, used propaganda and media to support the war. The CPI would have citizens purchase war bonds and report draft dodgers to the proper authorities. Civil liberties curtailed. During the war, the U.S. put the clamps on the citizens with anti-war attitudes. People who supplied the enemy with anything could be put in prison. In 1918, the Sedition Act was passed and did not allow any public expression of opposition of the war, which obviously that's a terrible thing because that's against the First Amendment. The climate of suspicion. With the fear of spies and large wave of patriotism, many German Americans faced tough times. Foods with German names were changed. German classes in schools were dropped, and German orchestra shows were no longer played. World War I and selling the war. In order to make the war more appealing to the public eye, the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, which was led by George Creel, used propaganda and media to support the war. The CPI would have citizens purchase war bonds and report draft dodgers, people that avoided the draft, to the proper authorities. Civil liberties curtailed. Civil liberties are your rights, by the way. During the war, the U.S. put the clamps on citizens with anti-war attitudes. People who supplied the enemy with anything could be put in prison. In 1918, the Sedition Act was passed and did not allow public expression or opposition of the war. Imagine that. You're not allowed to speak out against the war. That's against your First Amendment rights. A climate of suspicion. With the fear of spies and a large wave of patriotism, many German Americans faced tough times. Foods with German names were changed, German classes in schools were dropped, and German orchestras were no longer played. The Supreme Court limits free speech. Throughout the history, freedom of speech was something that made the U.S. unique. In the case of Schneck versus the United States of 1919, the court ruled that freedom of speech did not exist when the words uttered constitute a clear and present danger. For example, if you were to go into a theater and yell, "Fire, fire, fire," when there is no fire. Okay, so you can see increased government manipulation of public opinion and the total war in women. So the manipulation of public opinion is what was discussed up there, and the increased government is how the government controlled pricing, price fixing, rationing of food, control of transportation and export. Now we're on section 3, and you can see the bloody conflict itself. Combat in World War I. World War I devastated Europe and claimed many lives. America's goal was to go in and make a huge difference, a difference that, in their mind, made the war much quicker. But there still was trench warfare taking place. You guys can see all of the pictures of the trenches and how horrible it was. I wish I could make these pictures bigger so you could really experience what it was like. In the Western fronts, both sides would dig trenches to use as protection in battle. The area between the two sets of trenches was called no man's land. To break through the other sides, heavy artillery would be fired. Soldiers with bayonets would charge into no man's land and hurl grenades into the enemy trenches. There were new technologies in World War I. When both sides realized that charging the enemy produced limited results, they started using new ideas. In 1915, the Germans used the first poison gas. In 1916, the British developed the first tanks. Airplanes were also introduced into World War I, usually for observing enemy activities. Soon after, small bombs were dropped out of planes by both the Allies and Central Powers. The last major invention was the machine gun, and this led to some deadly air battles. Now, just to drive the point home, some of this, the gases that were used, right here you can see some of their effect. During World War I, a new style of fighting known as trench warfare pitted the two armies close enough to each other that they could yell across the lines, but soldiers rarely ventured into the area between the two, commonly referred to as no man's land, for fear of being gunned down, and the battles would often settle into stalemate. At the beginning of the war, military leaders were not prepared for trench warfare, where opposite sides fought slowly without much gain of land. Chemical agents such as mustard gas became a way to break the uneasy deadlock. Germany's first attempt at chemical weapons came in 1915 with the Battle of Ypres of Belgium in the form of chlorine gas. The gas cleared large sections of soldiers from the front lines, who fled once exposed and ultimately killed 5,000 opposing troops. Chlorine gas burns the throats of the victims and causes death by asphyxiation, which is suffocation, much like smoke kills people during house fires. And you could see the burns on the victim to the right, and that does that to the inside of your lungs, which obviously leads to death because you cannot breathe. So here is a chart breaking down some of the bloody conflict with the Western Front, the Eastern Front, trench warfare, and war in the air. I'm just going to let you look at this. We're going to go on to the next slide, which does kind of show U-boats, Americans in victory, winning the war at sea. The U.S. used solid strategy in the war at sea. The British tried to attack the German U-boats head on and suffered many losses. The U.S. decided to have warships protect merchant ships. The ships would travel in small groups called convoys. That way, if the U-boats decided to attack the convoy, they would have to get by the warships. The U.S. did not lose any troop ships on their voyage to Europe. German offensive falters. In March 21, 1918, the Germans launched a massive attack along the Western Front. Attacking quickly and efficiently, Germany was only 40 miles outside of Paris and had the city in its sights. However, with the Americans and the French holding off the Germans on more than one occasion, Germany was never able to get any closer to the city. The Battle of Argonne Forest. This battle was a major turning point in the war. The U.S., under the command of General Pershing, had over 600,000 troops, 40,000 tons of supplies, and 4,000 artillery pieces. For the most massive attack in American history, the Germans suffered loss after loss in this battle, and the Americans had opened a hole in the German lines. The war ends. In the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the fighting finally stopped. Germany had finally signed an armistice to end the war. In order to restore peace, a conference was called at the Palace of Versailles. Germany took the hardest hit. They were stripped of their armed forces and had to pay reparations of $33 billion to the Allies. This really sets us up for World War II, by the way. That sum was far beyond Germany's financial means. The most humiliating part of the treaty was that Germany had to admit guilt at the outbreak of war. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919. Now, in Section 4, we just look at the impact of what was happening, what happened because of the war. So during the war, Russia pulled out because they were having a civil war happening, and they killed their own czar, and they brought about they brought about a revolution that established the communists in power. So they come out, and then all of a sudden people start getting scared of communism, and so that leads to a Red Scare in the United States in 1918. There were also quite a few strikes happening because of the fact that people wanted equality in the workplace. So inflation leads to strikes. When the war ended, the economy was in turmoil. The cost of the war led to inflation. The inflation led to workers wanting to be paid more. When business leaders did not raise wages, some 3,600 strikes involving more than 4 million workers took place. The Seattle General Strike was the first major strike that took place following World War I. 35,000 shipyard workers walked off the job, demanding higher wages and shorter hours. This led to other companies joining the protest. In all, there were more than 60,000 people involved in the strike. The strike would paralyze the city for 5 whole days. Some commentators raised the alarm by calling it the work of the Bolsheviks and other radicals inspired by un-American ideologies, making it the first concentrated eruption of anti-red hysteria that characterized the Red Scare. So you can see that these pamphlets were all around there. Revolutionary pamphlets littered the streets of the city. One called "Russia Did It" proclaimed, "The Russians have shown you the way out. What are you going to do about it? You are doomed to wage slavery till you die unless you wake up, realize that you are the boss. You and the boss have nothing in common, that the employing class must be overthrown, and that you the workers must take over control of the job. So if you see that, then that obviously leads to the fear of communism, where people think that everything can be equal across the board. Obviously, that great experiment in Russia did not work. So then you can see the Boston strike, the steel strike, and of course the Red Scare continues. The Boston strike may be the most famous strike of 1919. Roughly 75% of the police force walked off the job due to no raise in wages. This led to riots, which made Governor Calvin Coolidge, who again recognize that name as president, to bring the National Guard. When the protester returned to work, the police commissioner fired the strikers and hired new police force. Never goes over well. The steel strike, after the police strike ended, the largest strikes in American history took place. Estimates that nearly 350,000 steel workers went for higher pay, shorter hours, and recognition of their union. In January of 1920, the strike collapsed. However, a riot left 18 strikers dead, and steelworkers remained unorganized until 1937. So all of this starts this concept of the Red Scare. You see that guy Palmer? I think he's a little cuckoo. Anyway, his house gets bombed, and then he wants to go out after people. As strikes broke out all over the U.S., so did a panic known as Red Scare. Many looked at the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and worried that with all these American strikes that the U.S. could suffer a similar fate. In June of that year, 8 bombs in 8 different cities exploded within minutes of each other, suggesting a nationwide conspiracy. Many people believed that this was the work of the communists and other revolutionaries trying to destroy the American way of life. So, Attorney General Mitchell Palmer established a special division of justice, and he did many illegal things, like he arrested people, tried to deport people, do all these types of things that were completely illegal. This agency eventually becomes the FBI. The agency specialized in ridding the country of threats. Thousands of people were detained. Another 600 suspects were deported and expelled from the country. Considering he was going after 10,000, that's not that many, but still. I conducted illegal raids with false confessions and no evidence of people I thought were Reds, communists. Because of this, someone bombed my house. So something that you should be aware of during this time is the outbreak of the Spanish flu. And you guys have seen this because the Spanish flu is also H1N1. And the next time that we had a deadly outbreak was 2009. And many of you may have actually been immunized against it. So it was very terrible because so many people died. And the worst part of it was that it was actually attacking people in your age group, or maybe a little bit older than you, more so than it was attacking the really young and the really old. So you can see that 500 million people got the flu, and it says it killed an estimated 20 to 50 million victims. More than 25% of the U.S. population became sick, and some 675,000 Americans died during the pandemic. It was first observed in Europe, and apparently, according to propaganda, they weren't to say anything about who was dying in the trenches in countries that were a part of the war, so they called it the Spanish flu because Spain was actually neutral at the time. And people altered their lives based upon this, didn't let you into theaters, didn't let you associate in churches or common places. People stayed in their homes because they didn't want the spread. And if you look at the reading, it says mass graves were dug by steam shovels and bodies were buried without coffins in many places because they just had that many dead people. And the people burying people were also very sick. Now, one of our last slides is one that I am not going to read word for word. President Wilson's 14 points I will just talk to in general. First of all, I will read the quote I will read the statement down by President Wilson's head. The 14 points was my plan for the post-World War world. It was designed to avoid future conflicts and ensure autonomy for peoples around the world. It was seen as too ambitious and unworkable. As a result, the League of Nations was the only major provision of the 14 points to become a reality. So you can read all of these different things, and these were ways that Woodrow Wilson really thought that he would bring about world peace. But unfortunately, all of this and the Treaty of Versailles actually led to World War II. Basically, the League of Nations ends up having no power. If you recall, Germany gets a feeling of, man, you guys are picking on us and we need to feel proud of ourselves again, which leads to Hitler. They were not supposed to have an army, but Hitler slowly starts to build an army. So all of this from 1919 to 1938, when World War II kind of officially begins for Europe, is based upon these types of things. It starts to establish the next conflict. So if you look at the last slide, it's just a chapter summary.